Hello to the Simpson College community and happy Easter. I am coming to you today as the chaplain of Simpson College to provide a message of hope in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic that we continue to find ourselves in. For those of us who celebrate Easter, we are accustomed to a day of true celebration and all that it can bring. A day to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the triumph of victory over death. The ways that hope breaks forth into the world in the midst of darkness and despair. And for many, this day is often filled with glorious celebratory worship, food and big meals shared with family and friends, egg hunts for the children, new outfits, and reminders of spring all around as we join in the celebration of Easter. But this year, things look a little bit different. This year, we find ourselves in a place where it might feel hard to celebrate in the same way, whether because we can't physically gather with our church community or with family for meals, or because our emotional and mental states are just really worn out after the last few weeks of physical distancing. The ways that our lives have changed are something that many of us have never experienced before, and this is all new. Well, on this day, on this Easter morning, I wanted to bring to you a reminder of words that are a part of the story that is retold every Easter when we celebrate the resurrection. I want to read a few verses from the Gospel of John. This is the end of John's Gospel account after the resurrection, in chapter 20, beginning at verse 18. Mary Magdalene left and announced to the disciples, "I've seen the Lord." Then she told them what he said to her. It was still the first day of the week. That evening, while the disciples were behind closed doors because they were afraid of the authorities, Jesus came and stood among them. He said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. When the disciples saw the Lord, they were filled with joy. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As God sent me, so I am sending you." Then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." As I read these words, I am reminded of the ways that Jesus meets the disciples in the midst of their fear, in the midst of their hiding. They are put away in a room somewhere. And I'm reminded of the fact that that very first Easter, before it was known as Easter, the day when the empty tomb was discovered for the first time, it was not a day of celebration. It was not a day of rejoicing. It was a day of fear. It was a day that forced these followers of Jesus into fear and trembling and hiding because they couldn't fathom what it was that had happened and what it would mean for them. They are hidden in a room in fear, and yet when Jesus comes, he says, "Peace. Peace be with you." Jesus knows and understands their fear, and yet still decides to come to remind them of the peace that God can bring. And so I'm reminded that on this particular Easter, that we are invited to imagine hope in a new way. We find ourselves sheltered, shut away, perhaps living in fear in these moments. And we find ourselves in a moment that is not unlike that first Easter. I imagine a dark, perhaps damp place, a room where they are hidden away from the views of others, a room where they don't know what will happen when they open the door. And as we experience this moment where we find ourselves perhaps hidden away, perhaps wondering when it is that we can open our door and enter back into the world with the glory of all that life has to offer, that we have to remind ourselves that that day will come. It took years and years and years for Easter as we celebrate it today to become that celebration. And the first Easter was filled with fear and a little bit of trembling. Today I'm reminded that hope has such a role to play in these days. Hope is the ways that we continue day in and day out when we are just not sure what the next day will bring. I imagine these little rays of light filtering through the room where the disciples were. And I imagine hope is like that right now. And so my greatest hope for you, for your family, for your friends, for your loved ones, is that hope can be that tiny ray of sunshine that can find its way through even the smallest crack, to shine upon your life, to make its way into your heart, and to provide a way for you to look forward to the glory that is yet to come. And so may moments of hope, the promise of new life that we celebrate on Easter morning, in the midst of the darkness that we may feel, of the fear and the trembling that we may feel, the doubt, the wonder, the concern, may the promise of hope, of that new life, greet you on this day and in the days to come. May you move forward into this day with peace, the words of peace that God has spoken to us, and the promise of the Holy Spirit living among us.